Helicopters circle continuously above Macquarie Island. Suspended beneath each aircraft is a large metal hopper filled with millions of blue bait pellets. As the helicopters move across the island, 300 metric tons of toxic anticoagulant bait are scattered over mountain slopes, valleys, and rocky beaches. They are not trying to destroy the island. This is a government-ordered operation designed to save one of the most important seabird sanctuaries on Earth. The entire disaster began with a decision that once seemed perfectly reasonable. Humans brought cats to the island to kill rats. But instead of eliminating the rats, the cats helped trigger an ecological tragedy so severe that more than a century later, scientists would need helicopters, viruses, tens of millions of dollars, and enough walking to circle the Earth twice just to repair the damage. And this is how that chain of events unfolded. Isolated in the middle of the ocean, Macquarie Island is a tiny piece of land located roughly 1,500 kilometers south of mainland Tasmania, Australia, along the route toward Antarctica. It is an extraordinary place. Geologically, it is the only location on Earth where rocks from the oceanic mantle have been pushed above sea level. Before 1810, Macquarie was a wildlife paradise. Millions of seabirds lived here. Royal penguins, a species that breeds nowhere else on Earth, gathered in enormous colonies. Elephant seals crowded the beaches. For countless generations, the island's seabirds had lived without any land predators threatening them. They had almost no reason to understand fear. But that peace ended in 1810, when the first sealing ships arrived. Within only 10 years, hunters had wiped out the island's original fur seal populations. Elephant seals were targeted next, followed by millions of penguins slaughtered for their oil. But direct hunting was not the worst damage humans brought with them. The real threat quietly traveled inside the holds of wooden ships, black rats, and mice. They followed humans onto the island and discovered an almost unlimited supply of food. Flightless birds and seabirds, nesting close to the ground, became extremely easy prey. Rats entered nesting burrows, ate eggs, killed chicks, and consumed native insects. Their populations expanded rapidly and also damaged the hunters' food stores. To deal with the growing rat population, humans decided to bring cats onto the island. At the time, the idea seemed completely logical. But what no one realized was that this decision would help trigger an ecological disaster lasting nearly 2 centuries. Once the cats became established in the wild, they discovered something simple. Hunting fast-moving rats inside deep burrows required a great deal of energy. Meanwhile, above ground, tens of thousands of large, slow-moving seabirds had almost no defenses against terrestrial predators. The cats immediately switched targets. Instead of eliminating rats, they began hunting seabirds. Later, estimates revealed the scale of the damage. By the 1970s, around 500 feral cats on the island were killing approximately 60,000 seabirds every year. On average, that meant about 160 birds were being killed every single day. And it happened again and again, day after day, year after year. But humans did not stop there. More introduced animals were brought to the island. In 1867, hunters introduced weka, a flightless bird from New Zealand, to Macquarie as an emergency food source. But weka did not limit themselves to food supplied by humans. They began searching for eggs, catching chicks, and feeding on small native animals. Roughly a decade later, during the late 1870s, European rabbits were introduced to provide fresh meat for workers involved in sealing operations. The rabbits reproduced extremely quickly. They spread from the valleys all the way up the island's steep slopes. Unlike cats and rats, rabbits attacked the vegetation. They stripped away grasses, dug around roots, removed protective plant cover, and destabilized the island's soil structure. By 1968, the rabbit population had reached approximately 100,000. Rats arrived accidentally. Cats were introduced to control rats. Weka were brought as food. Rabbits were introduced to help humans survive. Viewed separately, every decision seemed to have its own logic, but together they created an ecological catastrophe. Each human solution produced a new problem that was larger and more dangerous than the one before it. And when authorities finally tried to repair the damage by removing the cats, they accidentally triggered an even more severe ecological crisis. Once authorities recognized that feral cats were devastating seabird populations, the Australian government decided intervention was unavoidable. Simply reducing their numbers was not enough. The cats had to be completely removed from Macquarie Island. A feral cat eradication program began in 1974 and intensified during the late 1990s. Hunting teams used every available method, including cage traps, firearms, and leg hold traps. Over 6 years, from 1996 to 2002, teams spent more than 6,000 field days and deployed enormous numbers of traps while removing hundreds of feral cats. By June of 2000, the last known feral cat on the island had been eliminated. Seabirds began returning to their nesting grounds. Humans believed they had finally saved the island, but they were wrong. Feral cats had not only been eating seabirds, they had also preyed heavily on young rabbits. For years, the cats had been suppressing the rabbit population. Once the final cat disappeared, one of the rabbit's major predators disappeared with it. The consequences followed quickly. Within only a few years, rabbit numbers surged dramatically, eventually reaching hundreds of thousands of animals. This was not an ordinary population increase. The enormous number of rabbits began destroying the island's vegetation at an uncontrollable rate. From space, satellites could actually record the island changing color. Once green hillsides were stripped bare and turned brown and gray, large areas of vegetation disappeared. At the same time, invasive plant species, such as Poa annua, originally from the northern hemisphere, expanded into disturbed areas where native vegetation had been lost. The landscape became increasingly barren and severely eroded. Millions of roots that had once held the soil together were either eaten or exposed as vegetation disappeared. The ground became dangerously unstable. Eventually, the collapse of the land itself began burying the animals living on it. In September of 2006, a massive landslide struck Lusitania Bay, an area containing one of the island's important king penguin colonies. More than 500 meters of hillside, already weakened after years of intense rabbit grazing and vegetation loss, suddenly collapsed following heavy rain. Hundreds of king penguins were caught beneath the falling mud, soil, and rocks. Images of the disaster spread through news reports around the world. It became a defining moment that forced authorities to confront the crisis with far greater urgency. The Australian government and the state of Tasmania realised they could no longer deal with each invasive species separately. They had to eliminate all of them at the same time. In 2007, a massive budget of $24.6 million Australian dollars was approved for one of the boldest and riskiest eradication plans ever attempted. The objective was to remove every black rat, mouse, and rabbit from Macquarie Island. The goal was absolute, not a single individual could be left behind. They began with the rabbits. Back in 1968, scientists had introduced the myxoma virus in an attempt to reduce rabbit numbers. But because the climate was so cold, the fleas responsible for spreading the virus could not function effectively. Rabbit numbers fell to around 20,000 before rapidly recovering. This time, in February of 2011, authorities introduced another powerful biological weapon, rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus. Pieces of carrot carrying the virus were distributed in areas with the highest rabbit densities. The effect came quickly. Within only a few months, the rabbit population collapsed dramatically. Then came the aerial assault. Helicopters dropped around 300 metric tons of bait containing Brodifacoum across the island's entire 12,785 hectares. The operation was carefully timed for the harshest part of winter, when many vulnerable native birds were absent or less active, reducing the risk of accidental poisoning. The bait was designed for use in large-scale eradication operations, but its deployment still required extremely careful planning, because Brodifacoum can affect non-target wildlife if it enters the food chain. Conservation crews, therefore, had to travel across cliffs, beaches, and grasslands collecting animal carcasses by hand. Tens of thousands of dead rabbits and rodents were removed under extremely harsh weather conditions. Although the 300 metric tons of poison eliminated most of the invasive animals, the greatest danger came from the few that might have survived. If even a single rat or one breeding pair of rabbits remained hidden inside a rocky burrow, the entire population could rebuild within only a few years. Helicopters and poison were no longer useful for finding the final survivors scattered across such a large island. For that job, they needed the most precise detection specialists available: dogs. A team of 12 specially trained detection dogs, including spaniels, terriers, and labradors, was deployed with their handlers. To ensure they did not introduce diseases, parasites, or foreign seeds onto the island, the dogs underwent extremely strict biosecurity procedures. Their mission was simple but exhausting: search every possible hiding place across the 34-kilometer-long island and locate the final survivors. Macquarie Island is notorious for relentless winds, freezing rain, and deep mud. Among the detection dogs was Wags, a black Labrador working alongside handler Melissa Houghton. The dog's sense of smell was so sensitive that they could identify traces left by rodents long after the animals had passed, or follow the scent trail of a rabbit that had recently moved through a burrow system. In November of 2011, one of the most important moments of the operation arrived. Wags detected fresh signs of rabbit activity. The search team investigated the area and located a female rabbit hiding underground. Ironically, an animal representing more than a century of ecological destruction was found sheltering inside the nesting area of a seabird, one of the very groups that rabbits had helped endanger by destroying vegetation. A few days later, the final 4 young rabbits were also detected. Altogether, dog teams and field crews walked more than 90,000 kilometers across Macquarie Island, roughly equivalent to walking around the Earth twice. After years of continuous patrols without finding further signs of the target animals, on April 8, 2014, authorities officially declared Macquarie Island free of the targeted invasive mammals. Scientists initially expected the island to need 30 to 50 years before showing obvious signs of recovery. But nature began repairing itself much faster than many had predicted. Only around 18 months after rabbits were eliminated, seeds that had remained buried beneath the soil for decades began germinating. Tussock grasses returned to hillsides that had previously been stripped bare. Within only a few growing seasons, green vegetation began covering areas that had once been severely damaged. Rare plants that had previously survived mainly inside fenced areas protected from grazing began expanding beyond those barriers. No rabbits were waiting to consume them the moment new shoots emerged. A decade after the eradication campaign, the transformation had become even more dramatic. Vegetation grew so densely in some locations that researchers had to clear paths simply to move through it. Beneath the tall grass, penguins created their own trails between nesting areas and the beaches. Seabird populations also began recovering. During the height of the invasive predator problem, feral cats had killed enormous numbers of seabirds each year, while nesting success for some species remained extremely low. After eradication, breeding success improved significantly. Species that had disappeared from large parts of the main island began returning naturally to nest, without humans having to reintroduce them directly. The success of Macquarie Island quickly became an important example for conservation programs around the world. New Zealand is now applying many of the same lessons to restoration projects on Rakiura, also known as Stewart Island. The goal is to control or eliminate invasive predators such as rats, feral cats, possums, and hedgehogs from large areas. But the challenge is far greater. Stewart Island covers roughly 175,000 hectares, around 14 times the area of Macquarie Island. More importantly, it has a permanent human population. This makes aerial baiting, trapping, and the use of detection dogs far more complicated. Any control program must carefully protect pets, livestock, native wildlife, and other valued animals. Although early trials across thousands of hectares in New Zealand have shown promising reductions in invasive predators, the challenge remains enormous. Across islands from the Pacific to the Atlantic, conservationists increasingly look to Macquarie as powerful evidence that removing invasive mammals can allow damaged island ecosystems to recover. But Macquarie Island also carries permanent losses that can never be reversed. Human intervention came too late for some native species. The Macquarie Island parakeet and the Macquarie Island rail disappeared completely after the arrival of introduced predators and other invasive animals. They were unique island forms found nowhere else on Earth. No restoration program can ever bring those lost populations back exactly as they once existed. The story of Macquarie Island is a chain of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but together nearly destroyed a pristine ecosystem. Restoring the island required enormous financial resources, advanced technology, and extraordinary persistence. Nature can recover with remarkable speed when the pressures destroying it are finally removed. But reaching that point may require decades of human effort to repair mistakes created generations earlier. If you found this story of human correction and nature's resilience fascinating, subscribe to the channel for more real and remarkable ecological stories in the next videos.